Last week, we went through some of the developmental milestones and we really talked about the role of the media. We talked about certain developmental markers that our children should be reaching. And this week, we're going to really start to expand that conversation. And I'm going to do that by talking about what developmental psychologists look at the 5 eyes of adolescence. These are major developmental tasks that our kids are going to push and work through. And keep in mind, their brains are still developing well into their 20s. There's a reason why car rental companies often won't let one rent a car until they're 25. And we also need to keep in mind that the prefrontal cortex, the largest part of the brain that sits in the front, is responsible for decision making, right? That's really, really important. And of course, it's the last to develop. So, I'm going to weave in information not just about brain development, but also social development, social cognition, all through the lens of learning about sex, sexuality, and relationships. So, the first I that we're going to talk about is identity, right? Who am I? That's the largest, age old question of how I want to define myself. I remember growing up often being challenged by, am I an American Jew or am I a Jewish American, right? Am I an Italian American? Am I an American Italian? Those questions of how I want to define myself in the world. The interests that your kids may be in, from cheerleading and gymnastics to hockey and baseball to jujitsu, right? How is it that your kids are defining themselves as little people? But also, a big part of identity is developing a sexual self concept. And what that means is how they define themselves as a boy or girl and who they're attracted to. And that's really significant because if you think back to last week when I showed you the slide about the media and how it often influences our kids to think about how they want to present themselves as a boy or girl. And if you think back to last week, that box that I showed you about the qualities that boys valued as cool or girls valued as cool versus not so cool, that's going to greatly influence how they present themselves and how that can be really confusing and scary when you step out of that box and enter the world. So, one way that I try to break down what it means to be a boy and a girl in our culture is when I went into the classroom setting, I would often do values clarification. So, you can do this at home too. Maybe there's no conversations that you can have in the car, around the dinner table. I'm just going to kind of pull these up here. So I would start values clarification. Of course, you could probably start as young as second or third grade, but I would often go into classrooms in fourth grade and I would pick statements and I would say to the students in the class, do you agree or do you disagree? So, fourth grade, we would have really interesting conversations around, is it okay for boys to cry? Should girls be allowed to play football? People our age are too young to date, right? And so these may be personal values, but these are also values that are being greatly influenced by the messages around them. And it's not necessarily about what's right or wrong. It's about giving them an opportunity to formulate an opinion, to formulate about what they feel about something that's really important to them. Of course, as they get into the high school years, there could be values clarification around, as long as safe sex is practiced, a person should be able to have as many partners as they want to. That was always fascinating because, of course, I would feel like, well, no, right? But there were always students willing to push and challenge that envelope. And then, of course, you could take any one of these values and start to have interesting conversations as follow up questions. Does anyone ever brag in the locker room? What do they brag about, right? Typically, it would be about body parts and how powerful those parts are. Do kids ever feel pressure to do things that they don't want to? What happens at sleepovers? And you can see how these questions are beginning to open up their mind to think about how they want to define themselves. And the hardest part, of course, is there's boy code and there's girl code, right? You're not going to necessarily break down that code. They do need a sense of, power and autonomy over the decisions that they're making. But ultimately, you're giving them a space and a forum when you're talking about gender roles and expectations to kind of pick and choose what feels right for them and not feel so stuck in the box per se, not feel so stuck in living according to what the rules are to be a boy or a girl, but to challenge those rules in ways that feel safe for them. Um, I thought that these would be some good follow-up questions for parents because some of us do send our kids to day camp, some of us send our kids to sleepaway camp. And we have to remember, camps who are accredited by the American Camp Association or any real camps, right? Their number one priority is health and safety of your child. They want to make sure that your child comes home exactly the way they came to camp. And I think parents, do a good job asking about safety questions, but I think there are other questions that maybe are good to think about before you send your kids to camp related to gender. And so these were some that I came up with. How sensitive will you be when you group campers based on their gender? Do you overvalue or undervalue one gender over the other? How comfortable are you creating a program where 95% of the campers love it and 5% feel ashamed? When awards or recognition are given, what is it for? What kinds of achievements are they really recognizing? Are campers ever left alone? That's a big one. And what policies and procedures you have related to preventing sexual abuse or harassment? I'm going to be talking in the next week about how to minimize and prevent sexual abuse and harassment. But I think that is an excellent question in terms of, when staff training happens, how much time do they spend on that part of it? Because we tend to think about abuse happening, with strangers or people that seem scary. But the truth is, it's people that our children often know or that are closest to, unfortunately, that are often the ones that can be the perpetrator. And I do want to share like a personal story with all of you. How comfortable are you creating a program where 95% of the campers love it and 5% feel ashamed? I went to sleepaway camp. I love sleepaway camp. It was, an incredible experience for me. But I do remember my camp had an evening activity where they would take the male counselors and they would dress them up to do like a Miss America pageant with the male counselors, right? And everybody thought it was hysterical. It was like drag queens, right? Like dressing up their favorite male counselors to wear dresses and wigs, and everyone thought that this was hysterical. But imagine the child who is going through some questions about their own gender or is transgender or attracted to the other gender, and how much shame and embarrassment and humiliation they must have felt from that type of activity, all done in good fun. Well, 95% of the campers loved it, and 5% were left feeling terrible. And so that left a really lasting impression on me. And I can't imagine for the campers that were struggling what that did for them.
Mara, are you able to tell us any of like answers that you would want to hear from a camp to some of these questions? Um like if you go back to the slide,
Mhm.
um like what policies and procedures and are they ever left alone? Like what would you want them to say that would be reassuring or kind of a red flag?
Mhm. Well, I don't think that campers should ever be left alone. And I think there's a difference between giving campers freedom at a certain age, right, where there's oversight, but left completely alone leaves a lot of room for them to break rules. And so I think that the camp needs to do a good job making sure campers know what the rules are, but also making sure that those rules remain in place even when supervision isn't as tight. So I don't believe that it's ever safe for counselors to not necessarily, be with campers. Certainly, as they get older, it gets a little bit gray, but camps should be really open and talking to their campers, especially the teenagers, about what their expectations are and how to manage situations when expectations are broken or rules are broken. Um, and so it really comes down to creating, safe communities or safe spaces, especially within bunks. And camp simply taking the step to talk about that is an important step. And then how they reinforce that is, talking about what those steps are often and not just on the first day campers arrive. So making it an ongoing conversation, like we really value everyone feeling included. Well, then how are they making sure every day everyone feels included? And I think camps have done a much better job, but I know, some camps from doing trainings in the past, have accept a lot of campers. And so the ratio of staff to camper is good, but it's not something I would ever feel comfortable with. Having seen firsthand the other side of what it means to be a counselor when there's X amount of kids in a bunk. Like I think the ratio needs to be lower. Like I don't think it's safe to have just two counselors in a bunk with 25 campers. That to me is too many. I hope that sort of answered your question.
What feels like a good ratio?
Um, I think probably 2 to 15, 2 to 14. But that's also just me thinking off the top of my head. I'm sure there's more research done on that. I just know from my personal anecdotal experience, having gone to some camps where there were just hundreds and hundreds of campers, and I just couldn't understand how they could really have such oversight for that many campers. Nor could I understand how one staff training going over like bullying prevention for an hour, which is what I did, really sufficed for the whole summer. It was just sort of like a check mark on their box. So that's why I said like policy really needs to become part of their everyday culture, and talking about inclusion, talking about recognition, talking about what to do in situations where campers don't feel safe needs to be, an open conversation that's happening often. The second I is intellect, right? And so we know there's going to be this significant shift from young people thinking in a really concrete way to hopefully thinking in that more abstract, sophisticated way. So, how does one do that? Because really, this is like the foundation for becoming a sexually healthy adult, to realize that there's someone else that you may share your experiences, your body, your relationship with, and it's not just about me. And so we really want to begin to foster empathy. And empathy is a value, but it's also a developmental skill, right? And in terms of the brain, we know that there's two significant times in one's life that the brain is going through tremendous growth. Once is around the age of 2 or 3, and the second time is just before puberty. We need to take advantage of those windows of opportunity where our children's brains are the most receptive to new things. We need to take advantage of talking about empathy often and constantly. That's the same thing, often and constantly. We need to take advantage of talking to them often, because this is something that if we don't talk about often, it becomes much harder to acquire when one is an adult. And I can tell you that also personally, firsthand, having been a clinician and working with clients that don't have a good ability to take on someone else's perspective. So, how do we define empathy? There are 3 parts to helping our children build empathy. One is reading facial expressions. And so I would encourage, this is where emojis become a good thing, looking at emojis and having them name that emoji, having them look at emojis to identify how they're feeling, but also looking at other people's facial expression and body language to see, is it open? Is it receptive? Is it confident? Is it closed? Is it insecure? Is it fearful? And really beginning to look at people's faces to see if they can read the emotional expression. The second part of empathy is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And the third is having the appropriate response to a situation, right? Knowing how to respond when somebody is going through some sort of distress or in need of help. And so the more stories you can read to a young child about what they would do when, the more times you can talk about how to manage situations in the lunchroom when somebody's left out, or situations when everybody's got on their Snapchat map, where everybody's located, and so realizes that they haven't been invited to the party. The more we can talk about what it means to be consensual in a relationship, the more we can start to talk about and build what empathy is about. And so here is something that I would challenge you to do, and I hope that you would consider doing with your own kids. So, part of this whole empathy plan is getting our kids to think critically. So, how well does your child plan ahead and how thoughtful are they? So, I came up with different what would you do? Your high schooler is getting ready for prom. Your ninth grader is getting ready for a trip abroad. Your seventh grader is getting ready for a party. Maybe it's co ed. Your fifth grader is getting ready for sleepaway camp. Your third grader, a sleepover at a friend's house. Insist they come up with 3 unexpected things. Sometimes their language would likely be like the 3 worst things that could happen. And then challenge them to come up with an action plan for what they would do with each of these terrible things. So I'm wondering what if anyone wants to think about with any of these scenarios, if you want to share, what do you imagine the worst things that could happen in each of these scenarios?
You mean what do we think?
Or your kids might say, or what do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah. Which one are
Either
you?
one.
Either one.
Yeah. Because it's interesting. Like, you might think the worst thing that's going to happen is that they won't be able to sleep and they'll be really homesick. But they might think the worst thing that's going to happen is they might have an accident and pee in the bed because that was like really difficult for them when they were younger. Or they might think the worst thing that's going to happen on prom night is their date will leave them and they'll get into a terrible fight. But you might think the worst thing that's going to happen is somebody's going to get alcohol poisoning, and that's a phone call you don't want to receive. So it's really great because you can see where your kids are at and where their concerns and worries are versus where yours are. And then the most important part is that they're coming up with an action plan. It also allows you to see how critically they're thinking about, okay, this terrible thing could happen, but then what would I do about it? How does that sound? Okay. The third I is independence. And independence obviously is something that we want our kids to achieve emotionally, physically, financially, right? But there's going to be this huge push-pull as our kids get older. I love you, I hate you, right? Get out of my room and close the door. Don't ever talk to me again. It is so important that you can tolerate their anger in times of distress. And I know as a parent, I've got 4 kids myself, 2 of them are teenagers. It is really, really hard. It is really hard. But it is so important that you remember, no matter how many times they say they can't stand you, that you hold steady, and make sure you continue to remind them that you will always be there for them, right? That you can always tolerate how much anger they might have towards you, right? And underneath that anger, there are a whole host of other feelings that they're probably experiencing: disappointment, confusion, sadness, loneliness, right? But it all comes out in anger. That you can tolerate it and that you will always be there for them. I had one participant actually reach out to me during the week, and she had asked me, are you sure it's really okay that we talk to our kids about sex? Is it going to make them do it more? And I say this on this particular slide because one of the things that research uncovers time and time and time again is the more we can talk to our kids about sex, about drugs, about speeding, about cheating, you name it, the less our kids are likely to do it. And it just shows you the power of having a strong parent child connection to help minimize the very things that we don't want them to do. Now, of course, we want our kids to come to us, but I think it's also really important that our children have other adults in their life that they can turn to, right? Because when we look at resiliency, which is the ability to overcome adversity, one of the protective factors in place to overcome adversity, anything that's challenging your child, one of those factors is having other caring adults in their life. And so I want you to take a minute to write down who you think the top 3 trusted adults in your child's life could be if they ever needed support, or who would you want them to turn to if they needed support? And I just, want to encourage you to write that down for a minute. I also want to add that when I was in the classrooms as an educator talking to young people and would ask this question, it was usually 95% of kids could name a trusted adult in their life. Some of them would be cute and they'd be like, is my 15-year-old sister, does she count? Right. And obviously the wheels were turning and they were thinking about who they could go to. But there was usually like 5%, one or two, who really couldn't think of anyone. And so for me, that was, of course, also a red flag because, I would want them to have that person that they could turn to. And, I don't know if it's a red flag, but certainly a child who needed that extra support to think about someone else in their life. And so, it would be interesting to ask your kids that same question, but certainly offer to them who you feel that you can trust that they turn to. And I know even for myself, I have a friend who we both have daughters that are 15 and we, are different religions. We have some values that are quite different, but at the end of the day, we both agreed that there are certain values that we mutually share and gave each other permission to talk to each other's daughters. And it was really funny because the other day, my daughter said, Mom, Courtney's really starting to sound like you, and it's driving me crazy. And I was like, yes, that's a total win. And so it's really powerful. And I think fostering the relationship that you have with your own friends and allowing those close people in your life to have certain conversations with your kids, like I said, can be really powerful. Intimacy. This is the big one, right? This is the one that everyone thinks of in terms of how do we talk to our kids about sex, or intimacy is about sex. Well, if you remember from last week, it was pretty easy. And I shared the script of like, how do you talk to your kids about how a baby's made, right? And I shared with you by 3rd grade, our kids should understand reproduction. Another milestone is that by middle school, your kids should start to understand that yes, sex is how you make a baby, but sex can also be a special kind of intimacy or closeness where 2 people hug or kiss to experience pleasure and connection. I'm going to say that again because it's really powerful. Sex can be a special kind of intimacy or closeness when 2 people can hug or kiss or put their bodies together in a really close way to experience pleasure or connection. The reason why that's so powerful is A, if you notice, I didn't talk about gender. I didn't talk about body parts. I didn't talk about intercourse. I talked about closeness, connection, and pleasure. And that's ultimately what we want our kids to experience. With so much focus on sex without intimacy, right? That's all it is. But we want our kids to start to make that connection between sex and intimacy so that they learn to understand that it's powerful. Sex isn't something you get like a phone, right? It's not something that you give like your Snapchat information. It's a shared special experience together. And so, if we can start to help link the idea that sex and intimacy is that closeness that can be shared between two people, it will help down the road alleviate so much anxiety. One of the interesting things about teaching sex ed and then becoming a clinician is many of our clients that come to us are so focused on thinking that sex is a pass fail test, that if they can't have sex, it's not good. If they can't have sex, then they're not succeeding, right? And one of the things that we work to overcome in therapy and treatment is to help them like rewash their brains and recognize that forget about body parts. Aim for just feeling close and feeling pleasure and feeling connected. And that's the win, right? Without so much focus on body parts. So, talking to kids about this, or teenagers, I should say, one of the things that I would often do is draw a word web on the board, right? And I would ask teenagers, what are all the words that you would associate with sex? And they might say, it feels good. It's about how you define gender. It's what happens on prom night. It's how babies are made. It's associated with music or STIs or unplanned pregnancy for them, right? But then I would ask them about intimacy, and they would say it's about shared feelings and trust and closeness and having a significant other, right? And so really helping them see that difference and hopefully what we're hoping that they look for in a partner. Another way that I would have students look at intimacy is, and this is something you can also do. I'm just going to try and pull up the little words here. I think that's the last one. I would put each of these behaviors on a card, right? And I would have students rank each of these cards, and some cards would just be for middle schoolers, some for high schoolers. I mix these all up for all of you so you can kind of see, according to what suits your particular child or children. I would mix up all the cards and I would say, I want you to rank them from least intimate to most intimate. And what this, would happen is in the classroom setting, the students would really have to negotiate who, felt sharing a bathing suit was more or less intimate than going to the bathroom with the door open, right? Or touching somebody below the waist may be less intimate than oral sex, right? Or giving somebody a massage, somebody might feel is less intimate than giving someone a hug. And they would have to negotiate where they would put these intimate behaviors on this lineup. But ultimately, what it helped them do is recognize that there's someone else involved in these behaviors. This isn't just about themselves. And when we can help kids draw boundaries, when we can help kids learn at intimacy on a continuum, they begin to think less about the fact that this is something you do and more about the fact that these behaviors involve another human being. It becomes less objectifying, right? And it becomes far more personal. And some of the questions that these tend to evoke are about integrity. Do I think this kind of intimacy with somebody is morally right or wrong? What kind of physical risks and are we protected, right, in terms of physically? Maturity. Am I emotionally, physically, and socially ready to experience any of these things? And mutuality. What are the needs and desires and expectations of the other person involved? How are they related to me and myself, right? And so any one of these behaviors can be teased out with others, whatever you're comfortable with, and just kind of see where your own kids may create their own continuum. With my own teenagers, I put all of the physical ways that they could share their body with someone else, and I had them create their own continuum. And then I specifically said where I want them to draw the line for the age that they are at. And for some of you, it's very clear if you're following religious laws, particularly if you're Orthodox, right? It might be like when you get married, that's when it's okay to have sex, right? But for people who may not be following a religious structure, it becomes more up to us as parents to figure out where to draw that line. And our kids need boundaries. They want to have boundaries. Otherwise, they're left to figure it out on their own. So a little bit about the teenage brain, right? This is fascinating to me. So if you look at this picture, you'll see the hypothalamus, and that is like our body's thermostat. It really regulates the central nervous system, and it's also responsible for releasing hormones. And what's fascinating to me is within the hypothalamus, there is a structure that is larger in the male brain than in the female brain. And this structural part of the hypothalamus in the male brain is responsible for boys having a more intense interest in sex than girls, right? There's more of a curiosity, there's more fantasy, there's more focus on sex than in girls. And conversely, for girls, the hypothalamus is responsible for releasing oxytocin. Oxytocin is the cuddle hormone. It's what's released after you go through childbirth to start the process of lactation, right? But this is why we often see girls as far more relational. They tend to groom each other's hair and hold hands and cuddle, right? So imagine we have a boy-girl relationship, right? Where the girl is all interested in cuddling and the boy is suddenly starting to feel really turned on, and how expectations could then unfold with like, okay, now I'm this boy, I'm feeling really turned on. You owe me some sexual gratification. Or for a girl who's starting to feel all cuddly and the feelings of arousal emerge, well, then what do I do with those feelings, right? And so teaching our kids about arousal and how it's an automatic response that we cannot control. We cannot control that, right? That our bodies are stimulated by the five senses, and what is in their control is how they manage it. So talking to kids about how love and relationships and their interest is totally different than their sexy feelings and arousal that will start to emerge for them right before puberty. And so last week I shared about the marshmallow test. I don't know if anybody did it. I would encourage you to try it out. And this is, really good information, something that Rivka and I processed a little bit, whereas like, what about kids with ADHD? What about kids who are just generally more impulsive? What about kids who have learning disabilities, right? Kids who have issues that fall under speech and language with comprehension or oral expression. Controlling their impulses and managing themselves can be really tricky, or just reading situations can be extra challenging. So here are some ways that I came up with how we can harness self-control. And I'm just gonna talk for a minute about each of these. Developing a feelings vocabulary. We are going to kind of get more into that next week, because I feel like in general, our society is not in touch with how we feel, but helping our kids develop that vocabulary beyond just emojis is then giving them the language to express themselves, what they're feeling in their body. Are they really tense? Where do they hold that tension? How can they help themselves relax, right? Is it in their shoulders? Is it in their stomach? Is it in their thighs? Is it in their feet? Identifying signs of anxiety, and what does that feel like or look like? Or how do they experience that anxiety? By overthinking or worrying or excessively texting, checking in on their partner, right? Expecting responses. Teaching breath control, right? Teaching our kids really simply how to take that nice deep breath in and blow out. It's like my shoulders just totally relaxed. And teaching kids to do that at least 3 times is so important. I think I mentioned last week, it gives them that space to slow their body down before they react. I also got the name of my colleague who does breath work. I know somebody asked last week, so I'm going to quickly tell you who it is now, and we can also email it to you. It's called Magic with Molly, Therapy for All, and I will make sure that I get you her contact information. At the moment, it's mollybeanstalk.com. It looks like she has a website too. So that's for more information on breath control. And then obviously the last one is there are options for managing one's drive, right? And this really can be connected with so many other drives that we have. Think about eating, right? Just because we feel like we're in the mood for ice cream doesn't mean we sit down and have a whole tub of ice cream. Well, it could, right? But ultimately, we want to learn how to manage the balance of it so it's healthy. If one is experiencing the sexual desire in such a way, for example, that a boy has an erection, how do we help them manage that drive? Well, we have to explain to them they have three options. One is they could channel that energy into going to play baseball or run around or, think about something else to do. The second is that they could self pleasure, if that's okay with your value system. And then the third is, through distraction. So the first was like taking that energy and channeling it into something active. The second is that I suggested is self pleasuring. And then the third is just distracting themselves from the situation. So having conversations with boys about that is really important, and with girls, right? Because for girls too, I think sometimes they fall into a trap of feeling like they need to soothe their, I'm talking like in a heterosexual construct, they need to soothe their partners, their boyfriends, their significant others' needs. We see this later in life a lot. We see this in the therapy practice. But for girls to fall into a pattern that they need to offer emotional gratification or physical gratification for a boy is not okay. That's not healthy. And they need to focus on getting to know the person first. Integrity. These are our values, right? They're universal values, there are religious values, there's moral values. We need to really talk to our teens about what our values are. Last week, I shared that study with you about why rates of HIV were so high in this country compared to other countries, like Sweden and Denmark. And I told you what they came down to were honesty, equality, respect, and responsibility, right? And what that looks like in a relationship. So this is another activity. Obviously, you're going to get the slides, the presentation. So, in middle school, what I would often do is give them, moral situations that are actually not okay, right? Some might be debatable, but really that are hurtful. And I did this because I wanted them to see where values were then compromised, right? What values of privacy and respect were being compromised? What values of honesty and empathy were being compromised? What values of freedom and responsibility were being compromised? And these are great conversations to have with young people because you can see it really stretches their critical thinking. And it's not just an opinion, it's about getting them to come up with moral reasons behind why they feel the way they do. And then, of course, gives you an opportunity to share your value as well. So this is my favorite part of the presentation. I want you all to imagine that your children were given a cell phone and or they were to look in the mirror, because I know some of you might not have your kids, they might not have cell phones, or you don't believe in cell phones and teenagers. I don't know. But imagine that they either had a cell phone or the bathroom mirror, and every time they looked in it, they saw 8 values. Like every time they opened the phone and there were those values, or they looked in the mirror and there they were. So what values do you want your teens to bring to any and all sexual experiences? And like I said, I want you to imagine these 8 values are in front of their faces every time they looked. So take a minute and let's see what list you come up with.
Anyone can post any of them in the chat. It would be really interesting.
like we have a couple of people that have written things in the chat, but I can't see it. Rivka, do you want to share? I don't know.
I
I
think
can't,
they're all public.
I can't see it though.
Oh, so so far we have respect for oneself and the other, love, honesty, safety.
Mm.
Does anyone else want to put out any other ideas?
I think the second part of it is really thinking about how you then are going to express, that value and why it's important. And so the second part of the exercise is really to think about what is your message behind that value. So what I mean by that is like, here are some that I came up with. So personal power, your body and the decision about how you use it only belongs to you, right? That's the meaning behind the value. Any kind of sexual behavior that involves another person is an expression of intimacy. So the value here is that there's something sacred or holy about being intimate with someone. Being sexual with someone can be fun, but it's always personal and private, right? There's that value of modesty. Letting someone know your body is is an amazing experience. It should be done with someone you respect and trust. And then sex is a two-way street, mutual and pleasurable. And that's why the value of equality is defined here. So I would encourage all of you not just to use these values as a guiding principle for how you want to talk to your kids and your teenagers, right? The ones that you personally wrote down, but really to come up with the reasons why, because kids can't just take things as matter of fact. I mean, you can present it that way, but when you give them context for understanding why that particular value is important, they're more likely to follow through or recognize when they're breaking that value. And that, of course, there's lots of room to understand, well, then what's going on here? Does anyone have any questions? So I think, one of the biggest questions that I was often asked as an educator, time and time and time again was, how do you know when you're ready for sex, right? And for some people, as I said, who may come from a more religious background, it may be very clear that's when you get married. For young people who are not following such laws, it does become a little bit more confusing because, as I said, if we're not helping them come up with those boundaries, they don't know what exactly and how to evaluate their relationships. So after, you've sort of covered the prevention of infections and an unintended pregnancy or, preventing pregnancy, here are some questions to really think about. Do I know this person at the most profound level? Have I revealed myself to him or her completely? Have they truly revealed themselves to me? Do I know myself well enough to know what I have to share with someone else? And can I look into my partner's eyes and tell them exactly what I feel and what I want? These questions are pretty intimidating for a teenager. And many of them, unfortunately, if we're not talking about it, are really impulsive and they're not thinking about any of these things. They're really not thinking about the trust. They're not really thinking about how intimacy develops slowly and over time, that it's built on shared experiences. And so it becomes all the more important to ask these kinds of questions and to talk to them about, what it is that you're hoping to ask themselves. So this is just a cute way of remembering how to have a criteria for a sexually healthy relationship. And I've seen one called Fries. I have to look that one up for next week. But this one's Can You Have My Pleasure? Right. And so teaching our teens cute ways of remembering, can I evaluate my relationship to make sure that it's consensual, that it's non-exploitative or, equal? Is it honest? Is it mutually pleasurable? And have I done everything I can to prevent infections and pregnancy? And then
Mara,
yeah.
oh, so one person said keeping a shared experience in mind, remembering to listen and value a partner's boundaries.
Mhm.
And then someone else said that these questions and values seem to also apply to non-physical intimacy,
Yes.
that develops in a religious relationship or early on in others, being honest, respectful in conversations as well.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that they brought that up because, I think that is the only way that you can really tell within that type of relationship, right? How to evaluate, really getting to know the person and if they're being authentic and true to who they present themselves. Um, as we kind of come to the end of today's class, I think that I want to stop here because I've given a lot of information before I move on to the content for next week. This was just a sheet that I kind of put together about a lot of the different topics that could come up. And of course, you don't really have to score how well you've done. But I think that it is a good way to kind of go through where you feel comfortable talking about certain subjects and where you're struggling to talk about others, um, and maybe what's coming up for you. And then I also just wanted to, see if anyone had any other questions.
Somebody saying that these values you could also teach as far as like phone or online interactions. So like before sending a text, is this something you would say if you were looking into the person's eyes?
Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. It's so true. And technology is just, it's not even like we're in a shift anymore. We're just all in it, and it just keeps advancing with how our kids are using it and how much they're connecting. And it's so hard because I think we're all part of this generational divide where, we remember what it's like to not grow up with phones and to be able to get to know people and not feel the pain of missing out on experiences because the technology wasn't there. And now, you know, it's really hard. There's a lot of exclusion that happens and a lot of cyberbullying and of course sexting and sharing information that becomes so blurred. Um, so it's such a great point.
If at one moment I can offer something. It's actually similar to how I did this last week, like near the end of the session.
Yeah.
It might just be a coincidence, but you said something earlier that really touched me in regards to like my own childhood and then how I try to conduct myself as a father toward my son. Um, and that was when you mentioned that someone, and I'm sure other people are feeling this and wondering this as well, uh, is wondering like if it's really like important or even like how to speak to your children about these things. Um, I can tell you, and this is personal, but I'll share this. Sexuality was always a taboo topic in my house. It wasn't spoken of. And when I was 8 years old in the 90s and we got our first computer and we had America Online, I was not learning about these things from my family and people in a safe and healthy environment and understanding this as a completely normal subject that could be spoken about. Instead, I was learning about these things from other 8-year-olds at school. And so when we had the internet for the first time, the first week we had it, I crashed the computer looking at You Can Only Imagine, you
Mhm.
know? Whereas the way I am with my son, he's 10, and I could tell you for, I'm similar as anybody else here would be in like, how do you talk about these things? I can't tell you, but if you just start and say something that doesn't sound comfortable to you, the words will come to you and you'll see how they respond. And the conversations just flourish from there. And having talked to my son little bits at a time over the course of the last 2 or 3 years about sexuality and really normalizing the subject, I can tell you I've never seen the slightest bit of curiosity come out of him in the way that it was in me when I was around his age. And he knows that if he wants to talk about any of these things, he knows at least one person that he could come to, and it's a completely normal thing to talk about. So he doesn't have these curiosities that make him making terrible decisions or crashing computers
Mhm.
or
Yeah,
anything that he wouldn't share with me. And I think that's really where we want to aim to get to is be a little uncomfortable for the greater good.
absolutely. And I think, that discomfort that sometimes we feel is our own issues, right? And not our kids. And so if you feel particularly uncomfortable about looking at any of these subjects on here, you have to really ask yourself, well, what's coming up for me and what's my connection to any one of these boxes that feel like it's making it hard for me. And, you can reach out to me privately or, certainly you can bring it up for discussion. But I really appreciate you sharing your
Sure.
experience and how it doesn't have to be like the one that you grew up with and how you really had the courage to kind of change the dynamic.
Sure. I'm trying. I know what didn't work for me as a child, so
Mm.
I'm certainly trying to change that for my son. Um,
Yeah,
and yeah, the things that are the most uncomfortable to us and us personally growing up, they certainly are going to be the hardest things to bring up to our kids, but all the more important is why we should.
exactly. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that. I'm also getting another question. If you have a value of like waiting before you're married to have sex or something like that, how would someone like that talk about STDs or um, you know, how preventing a infection or things like that? Like how do you toe those both lines and
Mhm.
how might you have that discussion?
Well, I think you can state first and foremost, like what the boundary is within your family. So if you're following a religious law or just even a personal family value of like, in our family, we want you to wait until marriage to be intimate and to have sex with someone, right? So that's like what your own value is. And that's number one. And then the second part of the conversation is, there are other people out there that have different values, and so they become sexually active before they're married. We know that you can even share the statistic of 50% of high school teenagers have had sex by the time they graduate high school, right? And then we also know that 1 in 4 Americans, by the time they're 24, will have contracted a sexually transmitted infection. So even, though you may not be at risk because you're following our family's religious laws or, value of waiting, I want you to be aware that these risks are out there for other teens, for other young people, or for anyone in general who starts to think about having sex. And that's why conversations, with a partner, including have you ever had previous sexual partners, understanding that sex is defined as oral, anal, and vaginal from a disease prevention point of view, um, is really important, right? So I think, you know, kids can understand two messages that are of opposing views and how to personalize it for themselves. I think that's really good that we're getting them to that place that this is what I want for you, but this is how our family is different from other people who choose to do things differently. And this is what we need to be aware of. It's kind of the same for, like, drinking, you know? We tell our kids, you know, "I under no circumstances do you want to be drinking, but if you do drink, I also want you to call me," right? And so we need to still educate them on the dangers of drinking or drinking and driving or drugs, right? But if they should find that they themselves or a friend is partaking in it, like, that doesn't mean that you should fear talking to us about it. It's all the more reason you need to know that I'm here for you.
Right. And sorry, I know the time is up, but I just want to say, um, yeah, because we don't want to be naive, right? I mean, just because we're presenting our value doesn't mean that our kids are going to be like, okay, that's our value. That's what we're going to abide by,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah, knowledge is power, and I think it also helps solidify that for them, the reasons why you have the particular value that you're following, right? And so instead of sort of being in the dark or instead of not knowing it all and then making an impulsive decision and not having all the information, if they go against what the family value is, that certainly happens, right? We still need to give them the information that will help protect them. Like, we want our kids to make all the choices that we want, but sometimes they don't do that, and that's really hard. But if they choose not to do that, we're hoping that they have all the information that they need. How was this for everyone tonight?
Another great session.
Oh, thank you. I think I told everyone in the beginning, I definitely felt a little distracted and off today, and I hope that that energy wasn't, felt too much in the presentation, but um you know, I'm glad to hear that you got something out of it.
Yeah. And sorry, I'll just say one more thing.
Mhm,
I definitely got something out of it too. I happen to have kids who are younger than the teen or even
mhm,
tween age. Like my kids are 5 and 8.
mhm,
So, um, these conversations for me won't be happening yet. um, but I know even what you were saying before about, getting ready to go to summer camp, or I know like in the promo for this series, the question was like, how do you talk to your kids about going on sleepovers?
mhm.
So it, the themes are there.
That's so nice to hear.
Hmm.
And if I'm not answering, any questions that you specifically have, you can also anonymously email Rivka or myself, and we can anonymously, talk about it in the next session if there's something that anyone wants me to address.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mara. I mean, I definitely got a lot out of it also. And I think that you can use a lot of these ideas with younger kids and just tailor it,
Mhm,
like what you said about having them come up with situations and then what would you do in that situation? That could be relevant,
mhm.
for a second grader about
Yeah,
any kind of situation.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And I think, even for me, it's powerful to have this opportunity to share. I think I mentioned this last week, that full circle moment of like being an educator for years and years, talking to youth about preventing, STIs, preventing pregnancy, talking about healthy relationships, talking about sex and intimacy. But I didn't truly get it until I was in private practice and started working with adults who didn't have this information growing up. And it became full circle when I was like, oh my gosh, like I knew it was important to talk about intimacy, but now I really understand why it was important to talk about intimacy. And now I really understand why, people put so much value on the penis and the vagina when in fact it's not about that at all. It's just about experiencing pleasure, right? And like people forget that. And it's because they never got an opportunity to talk about it and learn about it from that perspective. And if we can make that shift and help, take body parts, like make it a little bit less about the equation and more about the connection, physical and emotional relationships would be so much more fulfilling. And with that, I don't know what else I got.
Thank you very much.
Thank
You're
you
so
so
welcome.
much.
All right.
We'll send out the information tomorrow of anything that we, covered, and the recording, and anything else that we remember that to put in there.
Sounds good.
See
All
you
right.
guys next week.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next
Okay,
week.
have a good night. Okay.
You too.